Hello and welcome to the course Basics of Experiment Design for Cognitive Psychology. I am Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Science at IIT Kanpur. This is the first week of the course, as you know, and we are sort of covering a brief historical background of where exactly the ideas about experimental design and the experimental method actually came through in psychology. So we will be doing a little bit of background story. We'll basically trace the evolution of the experimental and the quantitative methods in psychology. In today's lecture, I will talk to you a little bit about the obsession of psychology for being considered as a scientific discipline. There are a bunch of very interesting nuances about psychologists treating themselves or being wanted to treat, being wanting to treat themselves as scientists as similar to the natural science folk, such as people who do physics, chemistry, biology. Interestingly, if you see even in the Indian academic scene, most universities, for example, have the Department of Psychology in the arts faculty. It's in a lot of places, it's in the humanities and liberal arts departments and so on. So, is psychology a science at all? Is something that has troubled a lot of people across time, both students and practitioners of psychology, and we'll talk about this in some detail today. So, as I mentioned in the first lecture itself, there has been a preoccupation among psychologists about holding the tag of being a bona fide science, similar to, say, for example, physics, chemistry, or biology, as I was just saying. Now, what actually makes something, or what actually makes a discipline a science? Is it the subject matter of what is being studied? Is it the methods that are being employed? And what is the deal here? Let's try and explore some of these questions. So, as an academic discipline, since its beginning, where psychology was emerging, as sort of sharing both questions and methods with the philosophy as well as physiology, as an academic discipline, it needed to place itself in a way that people will distinguish psychology from mental philosophy that the American philosophers were doing at the time, as well as because the subject matter was such, it could not be directly linked to physiology as well. So psychologists wanted to place themselves as although related but distinguishable from both of these disciplines. So, the initial proponents of psychology, then sought to highlight two very important aspects of psychology as an academic endeavor. First is they wanted to assure the followers and the scholars, in psychology, people who were looking at the work that was coming out, that it would take forward the old and respectful tradition of moral and mental philosophy, extending back up to the Greek philosophers like Aristotle. So the subject matter basically, because we're talking about the mind, because we're talking about the human behavior, and there are several antecedents to human behavior that are being considered. So psychologists sought to ensure that, okay, we're not running away from these topics too much. There might be some difference in the methods we follow and the mode of inquiries that we pursue. Also, psychologists, because they wanted to slightly distinguish themselves from the methods that were being followed in philosophy, purely analytical and so on, they wanted to demonstrate that psychology as a discipline would follow very closely the scientific method for the study of human mind and behavior, trying to connect it or use the methodology as a bridge to connect it closer to the to medicine and the life sciences, which would basically lend it the same kind of equivalent status or legitimacy as a bona fide science. So this is something that historians of psychology have actually talked about in a lot of detail, but I'm just sort of trying to use this to give you a context of where we are coming from. Now, this claim to the scientific method was very interesting because it was championed by early authors like Hermann Ebbinghaus, John Dewey, even Wilhelm Wundt, who established the first scientific laboratory, first psychological laboratory in 1869 in Leipzig, Germany. All of these scholars opine that it is for too long that psychology as a subject had suffered under the metaphysical approaches that the American philosophers and the earlier philosophers were actually following. So there was certainly this need to graduate to something different. Now, how do you go forward from here? Because you've sort of said, okay, this is the method we're going to follow, and this will be a new approach to pursuing similar questions, if not the same, similar questions that were being attacked in mental and moral philosophy. So, to be accepted as a science, psychologists sought to emphasize the adoption of the method and the approaches to investigate these topics of interest. So, again, remember, as I said, the questions are not entirely different. They are sort of, they are more evolved versions, more pinpointed versions of what was being followed in philosophy. But the methods are the ones that should create this distinction. Okay, so the founders of the discipline, the founders of psychology in that sense, maintained that there was nothing inherent in the subject matter of psychology that would prevent it from being studied using the scientific method. So they said the issues that we are concerned with, say for example, what comprises the mind, the nature of human behavior, aspects of personality, etc., could actually be studied using the scientific method, and it did not rely only on analytical and introspective traditions that had prevailed so far. As a result, if you see a lot of early writings in psychology in the 1800s and in the very early 1900s, invested heavily on the development of appropriate research designs and techniques of analysis. And they were at the forefront of the investigations using increasingly powerful research. And something that is very interesting about psychology, which I'm sure all students of psychology would appreciate, is that the kind of control condition or the kind of obsession with keeping out the confounding variables, matching all the participants, creating these initial equivalences, is something that psychology prides itself in, and it is something that psychologists actually find missing in a lot of other disciplines, say for example in engineering or even to a certain extent in medicine. So that is something that is very important for psychologists, and it has been so for the longest time. There was also, we discussed logical positivism in the previous lecture, so there was also a considerable influence of the ideas from logical positivism on the methods that psychology was seeking to follow. So and they were basically, say for example, the things that we discussed in the last class, this idea of the tripartite process of observation, reasoning through induction and verification. So these were initially preferred methods of scientific inquiry under psychology. Also, non-observables were broadly excluded, and unless there could be an operational definition which could quantify these non-observable variables, non-observables were not included in the analysis or in the discourse or subject matter of psychology. Also, interestingly, most of the early theories in psychology, if you see, were limited to descriptions of the observed facts, mostly in forms of mathematical laws. So, for example, some of the earlier theories, if you remember the pleasure principle by, some of these psychologists and a bunch of other ideas, they are actually stated in terms of mathematical laws, in some sense aligning them to the natural science traditions, just like in maths, physics, or other of these sciences. And is this a wrong thing? It's probably not, because this is where a discipline is trying to distinguish itself against the background of what has passed, philosophy and so on. So to its credit, this obsession with the scientific method had served the psychologists rather well until around the 19th century, and a host of scholars were taking up psychology and they were following it as a scientific discipline, and they were more and more getting interested in trying to investigate and understand the nuances of human behavior as well as the structure of the human mind and so on. Now, let's zoom in a little bit. Let's see what is the scientific method that we are posturing with. What is the scientific method? What are the salient characteristics of the scientific method that psychology sought to adopt in its early days? Now, you can sort of say science, as psychologists wanted to appropriate, must be done in a cumulative and systematic manner. So, for example, the idea is that whatever new knowledge emerges, it should build upon the existing knowledge. It should derive from earlier theories, a test of them, verification of them, falsification of them. The idea is new knowledge should be building from whatever is already available, and it should be created in such a way, in a transparent manner, which should be publicly reported, so that it can be replicated by anyone. So it's an open thing, it's cumulative, it builds upon previous knowledge, and it is systematic, that you can basically look at the structure and you can take any study on a given phenomenon and see, okay, can I replicate it or not. The other thing is, if you want to keep things systematic, if you want to have this train of cumulative development, then one of the requirements would be to follow very well defined and specified methods. So in the sense, whatever information is being carried through, whichever investigations that we are following, say for example, we are conducting study, analyzing people's attitudes towards a particular topic, let's say homosexuality or anything like that. Now, if there are successive studies looking at this topic, these studies should be done following well-defined and specified methods, so that there is a broad agreement about if the methods that are being followed are within a particular paradigm, they are agreed upon by everyone. It's not like that everybody who wants to investigate this topic will come up with their own method and create their own investigation. There have to be some broad let's say agreements within the paradigm. For example, we talked about Kuhn's paradigm in the previous lecture, and that is something that is very, very important, that well-defined specified methods must be clearly outlined, and the observations then collected using these ways are comparable to each other, and they basically contribute to a cumulative buildup of knowledge. Also, what is this knowledge for? So using the scientific method, whatever insights and conclusions one is building, what are they for? So one of the things that science or psychological science, if we limit it to that, would pride itself in, is that whatever conclusions and new knowledge that we generate must be useful for, must allow for making predictions about future events. Must be, say for example, if you make a law of say for example, if there is a law of effect that doing this creates this phenomena. So remember, we have this in the behaviorist tradition, we have stimulus response associations, and we have those laws. If you figure out something, let's say the pleasure principle, that the organism tries to maximize the positive outputs for itself, or positive outcomes for itself. Now this should be able to predict future behavior. So next time if I take a animal model or a human model for that matter, we put it in a situation, the responses of the model should be in line with these predictions, or at least you can check whether the behavior is in line with these predictions or not. So cumulative and systematic, well-defined and specified methods, and these the knowledge whatever that is generated should allow for making predictions. Finally, whatever knowledge we generate, and it is used for predictions and it is used to understand human behavior, must also, just like all natural science, be open for revisions. It is possible that for some time these predictions work, the model works, but eventually, if you remember the the paradigm shift or the scientific revolution that we were talking about with regards to Kuhn, it is possible that one discovers mistakes, one discovers shortcomings of a given theory, of a given model. They should be open for revision, they should be open for modifications, for even, say for example, discarding some theories and replacing them with new ones. So this is very unlike, say for example, belief based knowledge, which is very hard to reject, because it in some sense sometimes it hurts the feelings of the proponents, it hurts the feelings of the followers at the same time, and in that sense you will find that belief based knowledge, tradition based knowledge, faith based knowledge is much less open for revision. Scientific knowledge, on the other hand, has to be open for revisions. It has to be open and accessible to change and modifications in light of new facts that are being discovered through experimentation and so on. So what are the broad characteristics of these methods? Cumulative and scientific, well-defined and specified methods, be available for predictions, and must be open for revisions. This is much in contrast with pseudoscience or common sense or belief-based knowledge that I was talking about. For example, a lot of belief-based systems lack the openness of testing, by other experts. So somebody, say for example, comes and says, I don't know, I believe that ghosts exist, for example, and then if you say, okay, can I get this belief tested by other experts. And the person would say, no, maybe you will not be able to see it, you're not capable enough, you don't have the ability for extrasensory perception or something like that. And in that sense, this conviction that is coming through belief is not verifiable. It's not something that other experts outside this particular individual can check and verify and prove or disprove this. So this is very different to how scientific knowledge is built. Also, if you see a lot of belief-based knowledge systems or even common sense-based knowledge systems follow very ambiguous, vague or vague, exaggerated or even untestable claims. If I were to say for example, that I have sixth sense and I can predict what is going to happen in future, something like that. Now this is ambiguous, because what is it that I can exactly predict? Or I am omniscient, or I know everything that is going to happen in the world. If I were to make claims like that, how would you test it? All right, you come up with tests and I say, oh, this my knowledge does not apply with this, it does not agree with this kind of test, and so on. So these claims are ambiguous, these are vague, these are not specified, these are not precise, and in that sense this undermines the tradition of how scientific knowledge is built. Also, interestingly, if you will see, most of these belief-based systems rely exclusively almost on confirmation rather than falsification. So what people do is, let's say, performing this activity leads to longevity. Something like, say for example, if you donate a particular kind of food to a particular kind of animal, it will give you these benefits. Now the thing is, if you do that, and if something nice happens, just how superstitions work, for example, if I wear my right pad while walking onto the cricket field, I'll make more runs. Now every time I do make more runs when I have worn the right pad first is counted as a confirmation, and it is basically used to sustain my superstition. On the times that I do not make runs while I have worn my right pad, what I will do is I'll basically say, oh, there are these other factors. So what I will do is I'll try and sustain my superstition by discounting the non-confirmatory or falsifying evidence, whereas every time I do make runs, I will actually say, oh, I made runs today because I wore my right pad first, something like that. Another very interesting aspect of common sense based or pseudoscience based knowledge is that it is tied to authority, it is tied to so-called expertise, it is tied to people rather than value-free or empirically grounded data. So I believe this because somebody that I know and I respect, I know to be scholarly, has said this. Now, do you go and scrutinize and verify those claims? A lot of times we don't. Is that the best practice? Probably not, because conclusions should be based on empirical data. As we've learned in the last lectures, falsification works. Falsification provides us the the tenacity to see, okay, this is the correct idea. So a lot of times when you are drawing our knowledge from figures of authority, by belief, by respect, or by similar issues, this knowledge is fallible, and it is not grounded on on solid basis. Finally, you will see a lot of these claims are sometimes they use misleading language, sometimes they use language that is not easily understood. So which is again something which is contrary to how scientific knowledge is built. You will see when you read journal articles, care is taken to be extremely precise, very clear, and present knowledge gained and procedures followed in such a way that anybody in across the world can actually follow the same procedures to see whether they get the same results or not. So in that sense, you can see there's a very stark contrast between knowledge that is arising from pseudoscience and knowledge that is arrived at using the scientific method. And this is basically what psychology as a discipline, at least in its initial days, actually even now in its initial days, was trying to emphasize upon, that maybe our subject matter does overlap with philosophy, does overlap with medicine, but what basically makes us a science, so to speak, is the methods that we are going to follow to make these analyses, to carry out these investigations. And in that sense, it's a good idea to basically perform an interesting comparison between how psychology stands with respect to other disciplines. So Boyack and colleagues, they performed an analysis of the citation data from more than 1 million journal articles appearing in over 7,000 scientific journals that appeared in the year 2000. What did they find? They find, interestingly, and I'll show you the figure just now, they find interestingly that if you can see here, psychology is one of the 7 major scientific fields of inquiry. Also, it is forming, it has close links with disciplines that also worry about human behavior, such as the social sciences and the medical sciences. In the order of things, you will see that it's almost a clockwise thing. You have maths, you have physics, you have chemistry, you have earth sciences, you have medicine, then you have psychology, and then you have sociology. So all of these disciplines make these clusters, and psychology is well situated. It has very good connections with disciplines that follow the same line of inquiry. So in that sense, if you see, it has a very good standing amongst the general sciences or disciplines that are considered as bona fide sciences in academia. Now, while psychologists are posturing as scientists, and they are following these methods, and they are making all efforts to be recognized as a bona fide science, are there challenges? Why is it that a lot of people, at least common people around ourselves, if you go out on the streets and ask that I'm a student of psychology, oh is it a science or an art or a humanities subjects? A lot of people will consider these that it's not a science, it's an art, or it's a humanities subject. Again, remember, there is nothing derisive about studying or being in the liberal arts. There is nothing degrading about being regarded as a humanities subject. But the idea here that I want to emphasize is that there is a lot of effort, at least by the kind of methods that psychology is following, to be seen as a science. So what are the challenges here? So let's see. For example, there are a lot of stereotypes about how psychology is stationed and what basically psychologists do, what do students of psychology study, and so on. So for example, you can Brisbane and Russell have enlisted some of these stereotypes. Let's look at them rather briefly. So if you ask a layperson outside on the street, somebody who's probably, let's say, not gone to university or something, they'll say, oh, psychology, you're studying psychology. Psychology probably or mainly involves an interaction between a therapist and a client. Myself, when I started my bachelor's in psychology at the University of Allahabad, and most of my friends were doing engineering at that time, this was a common refrain. Oh, now can you solve our mental problems? Can you read our minds? Can you counsel me, for example? To a certain extent, yes, psychology, studying psychology can allow you to do this, but is this the main job of psychologists? No. There is much more that is covered in psychology. There are many more nuanced methods that psychologists follow. Also, there is a broad impression that psychologists are mainly interested in abnormal behavior. They are interested in studying when behavior is afflicted by some kind of pathology, maybe some kind of a personality disorder. Maybe nowadays people are very aware of terms like ADHD and dyslexia and paranoia and a bunch of these things which have been presented in movies and so on, in books, for example. But again, psychologists are not only concerned with abnormal behavior. There is a part, there is clinical psychology, there are psychiatrists and people who are concerned with abnormal behavior and helping people who are experiencing that. But that's not all that psychologists do. So these stereotypes also have play a very interesting role in how psychology or psychologists are viewed in our society. Also, in some cases, you will see that psychologists are mainly seen as social workers. Help, people who provide help. They help and counsel afflicted people. Say, for example, when there are calamities, when somebody's gone through an accident, suffered some trauma, the typical hope is that there's some psychology, practitioner, counselor, for example, will come and have a chat with them, and they will help them. Again, yes, this is a part of what psychologists do, but it is not all that psychology is about. For example, I practice experimental and cognitive psychology. I rarely I'm sort of trying to work with some disorders, but it's not all that I'm doing. Most of my research is with normal individuals, undergraduate students, as most psychology researchers work with. And so it's not like I'm sort of maybe even qualified to go out and help and counsel people, because that's an entirely different stream of studying psychology. Also, there's a very interesting impression, anybody who does a Bachelor of Arts versus a BSc or a BTech, that psychology is much easier than the natural sciences. This is something that people will automatically do and fare well in without working very hard, without going through any maths, any stats, any scientific studies, for example. So that is also not correct. People who study psychology either in their bachelor's or in their master's, or they pursue their PhD in psychology, will tell you that there is a lot of work that goes in. It is sometimes I'll say equally hard as mathematics or engineering or something like that, or any of these fields like that. So these stereotypes sometimes give an impression to the outer world that psychology is not scientific, that psychologists are not people who work hard, who study hard, and so on, which is not really the case, as we'll discover during the course of this these lectures. Also, a lot of popular opinion about psychology and psychologists is framed by the depictions of psychologists in books and movies. There are 3-4 broad roles that you will see psychologists playing in movies and famous books. For example, some psychologists are presented as oracles. They have deep insight into the human psyche, and they can use it to solve crimes, detect what others are thinking, sometimes detect their intentions, sometimes control them, and misguide people to do stuff. Again, not what psychologists do at all. For example, social agent, as I was talking about this, psychologists will help people social problems and counsel them and help them. Yes, they do, but is it all what they do? All right. Sometimes, as there is this mad scientist stereotype, there are these mad psychologist stereotypes also, that psychologists or people who practice psychology are sometimes presented as an eccentric or romantic therapist, who possesses empathy and compassion, but sometimes is disorganized, disheveled. It's almost a caricature of a normal individual, which again I hope people appreciate is not really the case. Also, healer. A lot of people would ask you, oh, you're a student of psychology, you may not, you may be equipped to heal, our emotional and mental scars. You probably will never go through depression and so on. That's also not really correct, because this is not all the training that psychologists get. There is much more to that. There are more nuances here, and in that sense, what happens is that these stereotypes, while they may partly make psychology popular to people who are fascinated by these characteristics, but it does a very quiet disservice to the discipline, because it paints a very wrong image of the discipline amongst people who are not initiated in this. Now, there's also an interesting aspect here, that there is a perceivable difference between researchers of psychology, university professors who are teaching and studying psychology, as opposed to practitioners, for example, counselors and people who are out there in the field and applying the principles of psychology. So there are differences there as well. For example, practitioners rarely see themselves as scientists and researchers. They basically think that their job is mainly to apply whatever knowledge is already there and decide, okay, whether this approach, say for example, whether client-based therapy works, or cognitive therapy works, or rational emotive therapy works. So they think that there is this existing body of knowledge. I'll take this existing body of knowledge and see whether it suits well to my client or my patient, and I'll apply that, and that is the end of my job, which a lot of times is not, because the way a researcher would approach it, will say, okay, let me have this hypothesis, whether this will work or not, and I'll apply this, and I'll get my own findings, and I'll maybe publish those findings or try and advance this field of research. Okay. Also, psychology researchers have also sort of played a part, sustaining these differences. For example, psychology researchers have used very interesting terms. For example, initially they used the term new psychology, emphasizing the use of scientific method in contrast to philosophical or psychoanalytic approaches. People have used experimental psychology, to emphasize that experiments are used. Also, scientific psychology to again stress that, oh, it is more scientific and so on. Again, a lot of posturing, for example, to say, okay, this is what psychologists are doing, or this is what psychology researchers are doing, which is different from practitioners of psychology or practitioners of other behavioral sciences. Also, associations, for example, the American Psychological Association, at least initially, was comprised mainly of researchers working in American universities, and had little to do with the needs of the practitioners. It's more recently, it is sort of a more balanced approach where researchers as well as practitioners combine their efforts and combine their knowledge and share a lot of methods and procedures. But initially, a lot of academic researchers in psychology sought to distance themselves from the practitioners, which probably it seemed to them that diluted the overall sense of what psychologists were doing. Just continuing this, as I was saying, that a lot of people consider that psychology is very easy, it's an art subject and so on. One of the reasons for this fact could also be that a lot of people think that findings that are generated in psychology are not very different from commonsensical intuitions. For example, if I tell you that it's not a good practice to punish children when they are growing up, and there are psychological studies which have established the reasons for it and which have established the consequences of it, somebody would say that, okay, this is common sense. We all know that punishing young children is not a great habit. So sometimes what happens is a lot of knowledge that psychologists generate seems very commonsensical, seems very intuitive. But again, something that needs to be looked at is, where is the source of that knowledge? Is that knowledge being generated through common sense, pseudoscientific methods that we talked about, belief and faith and other things, or it is generated through actual scientific experimentation and investigation? All right. So this is again something that sometimes damages the case of psychology for being considered as a science. Finally, even amongst all psychologists, there is this disagreement between whether it should follow more of basic research and investigating the topics in detail, or be geared more towards the application part and the instrumental value of psychology in the real world. For example, should we consider issues about the human mind as as paramount questions, independent of the methods, but then more similar to the traditions followed in philosophy? Or say, for example, can we apply psychology or insights generated from psychology in teacher education programs, in training teachers, in training say, for example, therapists and things like that, that have more practical value? You do not really need to peel the layers of the onion and go very deep into this. As soon as you have some insights that are valuable for the world, let's take them out, practice them, and basically establish the usability of psychology. Also, as I said, the mind initially was confused a lot with the soul and so on. When you ask these questions, in Indian philosophy, for example, the questions about chit and man and a bunch of other very similar concepts also draw a lot of interest from religious studies. And religious studies have their own methodology, have their own way of accruing and stating facts. So a lot of people also say maybe psychology should talk more about these topics and establish itself in the common parlance in how people talk about other subjects. So while not everyone agrees that psychology should follow or stick to the basic scientific methods that it has been trying to from its inception. An interesting aspect also that probably I was going to miss here is that this obsession with the scientific method has been criticized for the fact that it is too individual specific, or in that sense actually not individual specific. The knowledge that is generated in a form that it ignores the individual completely. It ignores the personal and the social cultural history of the individual. It ignores the context of the behavior completely, because it is trying to come up with generalizable knowledge. So when you're trying to come up with generalizable knowledge, you're trying to say that, okay, say for example, individuals try to maximize positive outcomes for themselves. You're basically saying that this will apply to all humans as a species. You will ignore cultural differences, you will ignore personal histories, you will ignore the intentions and will and choice of an individual and so on. And in that sense, a lot of researchers, psychologists, following slightly different traditions, have actually criticized it, and they've said that, this impoverishes the data. It impoverishes and weakens the conclusions that we draw from psychological investigations. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next lectures. An interesting critique, that arises out of this, ignoring or this aligning with natural sciences and ignoring the individual, was basically offered by this German historian and philosopher William Dilthey. William Dilthey distinguishes between natural sciences and mental sciences. He says natural sciences should try to distill laws from a limited set of observations and then basically explore them, extrapolate them so that they can be applied to all natural phenomena or all similar natural phenomena. Whereas mental sciences like psychology should mainly aim at understanding and interpreting an individual or a person by analysis of his own personal and cultural history. Who is the individual? Say for example, there are many sources of information: gender, socioeconomic status, caste, religion, country. A bunch of these things should help, should contribute to interpreting the person's behavior, and not generalizable laws that are derived in, say for example, physics and chemistry, etc. So there are four very interesting points that Dilthey offers, and he says, psychology should follow these 4 points and basically adopt a slightly different method than it has been trying to since its inception. The Wundtian psychology and the obsession with the objective, almost the logical positivist methodology of doing research. So Dilthey says psychology should be content based. It should not focus on how the brain functions, but on what the mind is composed of. What is this mind? What is this abstract entity, the mind that we talk about, and what does it take into account? Does it take into account that, say for example, I am a male or a female? Does it take into account that I am born in a rich or a poor family? Things like that. And in that sense, he says that psychology should probably align more with fields, such as history, political science, law, theory, sociology, literature, and arts. So this is again one view of what psychology should be doing. Also, as I was just saying, psychology should aim to sample human experience in its totality. It should consider thoughts, emotion, and volition, and it should basically look at human behavior as an interaction between what is the person thinking, what are the mental processes that are operating, how is the person feeling, what is the person's phenomenal experience. Is feeling happy, sad, hopeful, dejected, any of those things. And volition, what does the person want to do, what does he want to achieve, what are the motivations that drive this person's behavior. And they basically say that these things are best understood in the individual context of the person, and in that sense the scientific method that we have been advocating for so far will not do a great job of this, and hence we should follow something similar to this kind of analysis that Dilthey is saying, the mental sciences approach. Also, context is central. When you talk about the interaction between thoughts, emotion, and volition, the context is extremely important. The context of a individual's personal and socio-cultural history, the factors that contribute to the identity of this individual, that factors that contribute to the specific situation of that individual in the society. The final element of Dilthey's recommendation for psychology was that it should not, the main tool in psychological investigation should not be experimentation, because experimentations provide ultra sanitized data. They basically control for all the possible confounding variables. They create this initial equivalence, this and that, and they basically create an impoverished understanding of the human behavior and the individual. Dilthey says understanding should be emphasized in psychology, and he talks about understanding at 3 levels. He says elementary forms of understanding should focus on simple problems of life. How does a person, say for example, get food, form an opinion about himself or people around him, and so on. And then empathy. Psychologist's tool should be empathy, using which the observer or the person who is carrying out this investigation can actually try and re-experience someone else's experience. Say for example, if you're talking to a patient or a client, or if you're trying to understand how does a person remember information, you should be able to put yourself in the person's shoes and then say, okay, if I were that person, how would I try to remember and organize information? Things like that. Also, there is a recommendation towards this hermeneutic level of understanding. What is hermeneutic level? Basically, in which an observed person is better understood, or at least you try to better understand the person than a person understands himself or herself. So that idea of that a psychologist, because he had so much knowledge and training, he will be able to understand you and your problems better than you yourself can. Okay, so this is again a very interesting theoretical stance that is offered to understand psychology. We will discuss more about this in the next lectures. Now, some of these recommendations were probably reflected, in the schools of psychology that followed. For example, the school of psychoanalysis championed by Sigmund Freud, and allied, schools in the same tradition. Also, there are other critiques of the scientific method, all right. Say for example, that it ignores individual differences. I was just talking about it because we are trying to generalize. So when we are trying to generalize, we will ignore that one individual is different from another. We are treating the data that I have gained from both of them as similar and comparable. Similarly, a lot of times people find that methods, the choice of method governs the questions asked rather than the other way around. It should be the question that should govern what kind of method I am going to follow. So, there is this preoccupation with a lot of psychologists that say, oh, I want to follow the experimental method, and I will attack only those questions that are tangible and can be handled within the experimental tradition and not anything else. So, it again prevents you from from approaching a lot of important questions and from developing a holistic picture of human behavior or the human mind. Also, is scientific knowledge actually objective? Is scientific knowledge actually universal? Again, a lot of people, a lot of psychologists even have claimed that these claims of objectivity and these claims of universality in scientific knowledge or psychological scientific knowledge are actually exaggerated, because there are confounds. There is the individual who is carrying out the research. There are other things that may have an impact. Say for example, a lot of findings people have seen are actually affected by cultural variables. Say for example, general behavior analyses about attitudes towards power, or attitudes towards gender, and attitudes towards how a person should be are actually affected by cultural constructs. You have this classic Marcus and Kitayama distinction between the Western and the Eastern world, the Western idea of individualism versus the Eastern idea of collectivism, and so on. And in that sense, are the findings that are generated in psychology actually universal? So a lot of research is done on these parts as well. So, while I started talking, started this lecture talking about the scientific method and its characteristics, and to some extent advocating for the scientific method, I ended this lecture with talking about the possible critiques and shortcomings in this method. So, what is it that I am saying? Should we stop talking about the scientific method? Should we unfollow the scientific method and try and look for other approaches? The idea is that there are probably more gains than losses. There are obviously trade-offs. There is, say for example, when you are carrying out an experiment, there is an understanding that the generalizability of the data gained through this experiment will not be as much as, say for example, if you were following some other approaches. So those things are there, but these are informed choices. These are not guesses. This is not not guided by belief or faith, rather an informed choice that an individual makes, that some phenomena are best studied, if you want to, say for example, decipher causal relationships, are best studied using the scientific experimental method, and some other phenomena may be better understood by something else. Say for example, if you want to sample the human experience of calamities, for example, when people are afflicted with earthquakes, tsunami, riots and this and that, maybe that is better studied through a qualitative method of semi-structured interviews, phenomenal experiences and so on. So there is obviously merit to both kinds of traditions, and in the next couple of lectures we will go slightly in more detail with respect to the quantitative and the qualitative methods. All right, thank you.